The morning sun of Centauri Prime cast long shadows across the Galactic Academy campus. Students from dozens of different worlds walked along the crystal pathways, their various forms creating a strange parade of shapes and colors. Some floated, some crawled, some moved on too many legs to count easily. Jake Miller walked among them, looking perfectly ordinary by human standards, but completely unique in this place. He was the only human at the academy, part of a new exchange program that had started just months ago. His species was still new to the galactic community, still learning how things worked out here among the stars. The lecture hall was enormous, built to hold students of all sizes. Jake found his usual seat in the back row, a spot that gave him a good view of everything without drawing attention to himself. He pulled out his notebook and pen, old-fashioned tools that some of his classmates found curious. Around him, other students settled into their seats. A crystalline being that looked like living glass took the seat to his left. Its name was something Jake could not pronounce, so he just thought of it as Crystal. To his right, a creature that seemed to be made of flowing water in a containment. Suit gurgled softly as it arranged its study materials. Professor Zethkar entered the hall with the confidence of someone who had given this lecture many times before. He was a Velthari, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and large compound eyes that could see in several directions at once. His skin was a deep purple color that shifted slightly in the light. Welcome, students, to the most important course you will take at this academy, the professor began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. Today we begin our study of Deathworld beasts and their evolutionary adaptations. A ripple of nervous energy passed through the classroom. Even Jake could feel it. This was the course that many students feared, but all respected. It was said that understanding Deathworld creatures was essential for any serious xenobiologist. First, let me explain what we mean by a Deathworld, Professor Zethkar continued. He gestured with one of his arms, and a holographic display appeared above. The class. A Deathworld is a planet where the conditions are so harsh, so dangerous, that only the most extreme life forms can survive. The display showed a planet covered in what looked like storms of acid. Lightning flashed constantly across its surface, and the very ground seemed to be moving and shifting. These worlds create the most dangerous predators in the galaxy, the professor said. Creatures that have evolved beyond what we might think possible. They develop abilities that seem to break the laws of nature itself. Jake made a note in his notebook. Around him, other students were recording the lecture in various ways. Some used devices that projected light patterns. Others seemed to be absorbing the information directly into their bodies. Let me show you some examples, Professor Zethkar said. The holographic display changed to show a creature that looked like a nightmare made real. It had too many teeth, too many claws, and skin that seemed to shift and change color as they watched. This is a Thrushmaw from Kepler 442b, the professor explained. It can spit acid that will dissolve most known metals. Its claws can cut through our strongest armor, and it is intelligent enough to use tools and set traps for its prey. Several students made sounds of fear or disgust. The crystalline being next to Jake actually dimmed, as if trying to make itself less visible. The display changed again, showing a creature that seemed to fade in and out of sight. The void stalkers of Proxima Centauri C can become invisible at will. They hunt in packs and can communicate across vast distances using sounds that most species cannot even hear. Professor, called out a student from the middle of the room. It was one of the insect-like Cathari, its mandibles clicking nervously. How do these creatures even exist? How can evolution create something so dangerous? Professor Zethkar nodded approvingly at the question. Excellent question, Blade Dancer. The answer is pressure. When a world is trying to kill everything that lives on it, only the strongest, fastest, smartest, and most adaptable survive. Over millions of years, this creates creatures that are perfectly designed for killing and surviving. Jake looked up from his notes. What about creatures that eat both plants and animals? Would they be different? The professor's compound eyes focused on Jake. It was the first time the human had spoken in class, and his question showed he was thinking about the subject in a deeper way than most students. An interesting question, Mr. Miller, the professor said. However, Deathworld evolution usually forces creatures to specialize. A predator that tries to do everything rarely becomes truly excellent at any one thing. Jake nodded and made another note. But what if the world had many different environments? Wouldn't that force a creature to be good at many things? Professor Zethkar paused, considering the question. Around the classroom, other students were looking at Jake with new interest. The humans seemed to understand something about evolution that they were still struggling with. Such a world would be extremely rare, the professor finally said. A planet with multiple hostile environments would be almost impossible to survive on. No known death world has that level of complexity. Almost impossible, Jake repeated quietly. Writing in his notebook, the professor continued with his lecture, showing more examples of death world creatures. There were things that could fly at impossible speeds, creatures that could survive in the vacuum of space, and predators that could track their prey across entire continents. With each new example, the alien students became more and more nervous. Some of them came from worlds with dangerous creatures, but nothing like what they were seeing here. These Deathworld beasts were beyond anything in their experience. Jake continued taking notes, occasionally asking questions that showed he was thinking about the subject in ways that impressed the professor. He asked about pack hunting strategies, about how creatures might adapt to changing environments, and about what would happen if different Deathworld species ever met each other. As the lecture continued, Jake found himself smiling slightly. The creatures the professor was showing were certainly impressive, and he could understand why his classmates were so frightened by them. But there was something amusing about the whole situation that he could not quite put into words. When the class finally ended, students filed out of the hall in small groups, talking quietly among themselves about what they had learned. Many of them seemed shaken by what they had seen. Jake packed up his simple notebook and pen, and walked out with the others. As he passed the professor, Zethkar called out to him, "Mr. Miller, your questions today were quite insightful. You seem to have a natural understanding of predator evolution." Jake paused and smiled. "Thank you, Professor. I find it all very interesting. I look forward to learning more." As Jake walked away, Professor Zethkar watched him go. There was something about the human's calm confidence that was puzzling. Most students were at least a little frightened by their first Deathworld lecture, but Jake had seemed almost amused. 3 days later, Jake returned to the lecture hall for the second part of Professor Zethkar's course. The same students filled the same seats, but there was a different feeling in the air now. Everyone knew what they were here to learn about, and the nervous energy was stronger than before. Professor Zethkar entered the hall carrying a stack of data tablets. His forearms moved with practiced efficiency as he set up the holographic display system. "Today we will learn about the Galactic Coalition's official system for classifying Deathworld beasts," he announced. "This system has been developed over centuries of study and has helped keep our explorers and researchers alive." The holographic display showed a simple chart with 4 levels. Each level had a different color, from yellow to red to black. Class 1 threats are dangerous, but manageable. The professor explained, "These are creatures that can kill an unprepared individual, but can be avoided or fought off with proper equipment and training." An image appeared showing a creature that looked like a giant spider with metal legs. It was certainly frightening, but Jake could see that it moved in predictable ways. Class 2 threats are lethal to most species, Professor Zethkar continued. These creatures require special equipment and careful planning to encounter safely. Most civilian personnel are not allowed on worlds where Class 2 threats exist. Bleh. New image showed something that looked like a living shadow with too many teeth. It seemed to move through solid objects as if they were not there. Class 3 threats are considered extinction level, the professor said, and his voice became more serious. These creatures are so dangerous that they could wipe out entire colonies or expeditions. Only our most advanced military units are equipped to deal with Class 3 threats. The image changed to show something that Jake found genuinely impressive. It was enormous, covered in what looked like armor plating, and had weapons that seemed to grow from its body. Energy crackled around it like lightning. And finally, Professor Zethkar said, we have the theoretical Class 4 category. The display went blank. Class 4 threats are considered impossible by current scientific understanding, the professor explained. The energy requirements alone would make such creatures unable to survive. They exist only in theoretical models and fiction. A student near the front raised a tentacle. Professor, why do we even have a Class 4 category if such creatures cannot exist? Good question, Slime Trail of Wisdom, the professor replied. We include it to remind ourselves of the limits of what evolution can achieve. It helps us understand why the creatures we have studied are as dangerous as they can possibly be. Jake raised his hand. Professor, how do you classify a creature that uses tools? Professor Zethkar's compound eyes focused on Jake again. Tool use is extremely rare among Deathworld beasts. It requires intelligence, and high intelligence usually comes at the cost of physical adaptations. But what if a creature evolved? Both? Jake asked. What if it was physically dangerous and intelligent enough to make weapons? A question made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. The crystalline being next to Jake actually made a sound like breaking glass. Such a creature would be very concerning, the professor admitted. However, evolution does not work that way. Intelligence and physical prowess require different evolutionary pressures. A creature cannot optimize for both. Jake made a note in his notebook. What about social hunting, if intelligent creatures work together? Again, theoretically interesting, but practically impossible, Professor Zethkar said. Deathworld conditions do not favor cooperation. Resources are too scarce, survival too difficult. The professor moved on to discuss specific examples of each threat class. He showed them creatures that could regenerate lost limbs in minutes, predators that could survive in the vacuum of space, and things that seemed to violate basic physics. With each example, Jake asked questions that showed he was thinking about the subject in complex ways. He wanted to know about adaptation rates, about how creatures learned new behaviors, about what happened when different species competed for the same resources. Mr. Miller, the professor said after Jake's seventh question, you seem particularly interested in evolutionary adaptation. Do you have experience with dangerous wildlife on your homeworld? Jake paused, his pen hovering over his notebook. Around the classroom, alien students turned to look at him with curiosity. Some, Jake said simply. Nothing too exciting. What kind of creatures? Asked Blade Dancer, the insect-like student. We have heard very little about Earth's wildlife. Jake thought for a moment. Well, there are large predators that hunt in packs. They can track prey for days and coordinate their attacks. And there are solitary hunters that can kill prey much larger than themselves. The alien students exchanged glances. That sounded more dangerous than they had expected from a garden world. What about defensive adaptations? Asked Crystal, the being made of living glass. Do your world's prey animals have ways to protect themselves? Oh yes, Jake said, warming to the subject. Some have thick armor plating. Others have poison that can kill a predator in minutes. Some can run at incredible speeds, and others can hide so well that you might never see them, even if you know exactly where they are. Professor Zethkar was listening with growing interest. These sound like quite advanced adaptations for a garden world. What kind of environmental pressures drove such evolution? Jake shrugged. Earth has lots of different environments. Deserts, where the temperature can kill you. Frozen areas where nothing should be able to live. Deep forests where you cannot see the sky. An ocean so deep that the pressure would crush most creatures. Multiple extreme environments on a single world? Professor Zethkar asked. That is unusual, but not unheard of. However, it still would not explain the level of adaptation you are describing. Well, Jake said thoughtfully, Earth also has some other challenges. The weather can be pretty extreme. Storms that can level cities, winds that can pick up heavy objects and throw them around, floods that can appear without warning. The alien students were staring at Jake now. That did not sound like a garden world at all. What about geological activity? The professor asked. Oh, that too, Jake said casually. Volcanoes, earthquakes, that sort of thing. The ground shakes pretty regularly in some places. And sometimes chunks of rock fall from space and hit the planet. The classroom had gone very quiet. Mr. Miller, Professor Zethkar said slowly, are you certain that Earth is classified as a garden world in our databases? Jake looked up from his notebook with a slightly puzzled expression. I think so. Why? Professor Zethkar activated his personal data tablet and began searching through the galactic databases. His compound eyes moved rapidly as he scanned through information. According to our records, Sol 3, also known as Earth, is indeed classified as a garden world, he said. Pleasant climate, abundant water resources, stable geology, and diverse but non-threatening flora and fauna. Jake nodded. That sounds about right, but Professor Zethkar was still reading, and his expression was becoming more confused. However, there are some discrepancies in the data. References to something called natural disasters and extreme weather events. Oh, those happen everywhere, don't they? Jake asked innocently. No, Mr. Miller, they do not, the professor said. Most garden worlds have very stable conditions. Jake looked genuinely surprised. Really? How do species adapt and evolve without environmental pressure? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the classroom, alien students were beginning to look at Jake with something that might have been suspicion, or possibly fear. Professor Zethkar closed his data tablet. We will ... continue this discussion in our next class. For now, let us return to our classification system. But for the rest of the lecture, the professor seemed distracted, and Jake continued to ask questions that suggested he knew more about dangerous creatures than any garden world inhabitant should. Professor Zethkar had spent the entire night researching. Something about Jake Miller's casual comments had bothered him, and he wanted to be prepared for today's lecture. He had pulled up every file the Galactic Coalition had on Earth, and what he found was ... confusing ... The official classification still listed Earth as a garden world, but there were footnotes. Lots of footnotes. References to natural disaster management, extreme weather preparation, and dangerous wildlife protocols that seemed odd for a supposedly peaceful planet. Jake arrived early for the third lecture, as he had for the previous two. He settled into his usual seat in the back row and pulled out his simple notebook and pen. Other students filed in around him, the same mix of crystalline beings, floating creatures, and things that defied easy description. Today we will examine the galaxy's most notorious Deathworld environments, Professor Zethkar announced once everyone was seated. Each of these worlds represents a different type of evolutionary pressure, creating unique forms of deadly life. The holographic display activated, showing a planet that looked like it was covered in fire. The surface glowed red and orange, with streams of lava flowing like rivers. Kepler 442b, the professor said. Surface temperatures that change by 200 degrees every 12 hours. Constant volcanic activity. Atmospheric pressure that would crush most species. And storms of acid rain that can dissolve metal. Several students made sounds of distress. The water creature to Jake's right actually seemed to shrink smaller in its containment suit. The apex predator of this world is the Threshmaw, Professor Zethkar continued. It has developed armor plating stronger than our best military alloys. Its internal organs can survive being cooked by lava flows, and it hunts by diving into pools of molten rock and waiting for prey to come close enough to grab. An image of the Threshmaw appeared, and even Jake had to admit it looked impressive. It was roughly the size of a small building, covered in overlapping plates that glowed with internal heat, and had jaws that could probably bite a hover car in half. The creatures that survive on Kepler 442b do so by becoming living weapons. The professor explained. Every adaptation is focused on killing or avoiding being killed in conditions that would destroy most known materials. Jake raised his hand. Professor, what do they eat? There can't be much plant life in those conditions. Excellent observation, Mr. Miller. They are entirely carnivorous, feeding on each other in a constant cycle of predation. The entire ecosystem is based on who can kill whom. Jake made a note, then asked, how do they reproduce? Raising young. In those conditions would be nearly impossible. Professor Zethkar paused. It was another insightful question that showed deep thinking about survival strategies. The young are essentially born as weapons. They must be capable of independent survival from the moment they hatch, or they become food for others. The professor moved on to the next example. The display showed a world covered in strange, twisted structures that seemed to move even though they were clearly made of rock. Proxima Centauri C, he announced. A world where the very landscape is hostile. The rock formations you see are actually living creatures, massive colony organisms that can reshape themselves at will. The alien students stared in horror at the writhing stone formations. The void stalkers that live here have developed the ability to phase through solid matter. They can become incorporeal at will, allowing them to pass through the living rock and ambush prey from any direction. How do they coordinate their hunts? Jake asked. They communicate through subsonic vibrations that can travel through solid rock for hundreds of kilometers. A single pack can coordinate across an entire continent. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That's remarkably efficient. Do they have territories? Or do the packs work together? Again, Professor Zethkar found himself impressed by the depth of Jake's questions. They maintain complex territorial boundaries that shift based on resource availability and pack strength. The social structure is quite sophisticated. Sophisticated pack hunters that can phase through matter and communicate across continents. Jake mused, writing in his notebook. That's actually quite elegant from an evolutionary standpoint. The professor stared at Jake for a moment. There was something in the human's tone that suggested he was evaluating the void stalkers as if they WERE competitors. Mr. Miller, Professor Zethkar said slowly, you seem remarkably calm when discussing these creatures. Most students find them quite disturbing. Jake looked up from his notes with a slight smile. They're certainly interesting, but every predator has weaknesses, right? The Threshmaws need high temperatures, so they'd be vulnerable in cold environments. The void stalkers rely on their phasing ability, but that probably takes a lot of energy. The classroom had gone very quiet. Even the background humming of the building's systems seemed louder than usual. You're thinking about how to fight them, Blade Dancer said, her mandibles clicking nervously. Not fight, Jake corrected gently. Survive. Understanding a predator's limitations is the key to avoiding it. Or in some cases, to coexisting with it. Coexisting? Crystal asked, her voice sounding like wind chimes in a storm. With Class 3 threats? Why not? Jake shrugged. Every ecosystem has rules. Learn the rules, follow them, and you're just another part of the environment instead of an intruder. Professor Zithkar felt a chill run through his body. The human was talking about Deathworld predators, the way most people talked about local wildlife. Mr. Miller, the professor said carefully, these creatures have wiped out entire research expeditions. Military units with advanced weapons and armor have been destroyed by single individuals of these species. That's probably because they went in thinking like invaders instead of residents, Jake replied. If you show up with weapons and armor, you're obviously a threat. Most predators will respond to threats with violence. What would you suggest instead? The professor asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Observation first, Jake said. Watch from a distance, learn the behavioral patterns, understand the ecosystem. Figure out what they eat, when they hunt, how they communicate. Then adapt your behavior to fit their expectations. And if that doesn't work? Slime Trail of Wisdom asked from across the room. Jake's smile became a little sharper. Then you make sure you're more dangerous than they are. The silence that followed was deafening. Every alien student in the room was staring at Jake with expressions ranging from shock to terror. Professor Zethkar cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the lecture. Let us continue with our catalog. He showed them more Deathworlds. Planets where the rain was acid, where the plants hunted animals, where gravity was so strong that movement required incredible strength. Each world had produced creatures that seemed designed by nightmares. But with each new example, Jake asked questions that showed he was thinking about them strategically. He wanted to know about migration patterns, about how they detected prey, about what they feared. You're building a survival guide, Professor Zethkar realized about halfway through the lecture. Just taking notes, Jake said innocently. But his notebook was indeed filling up with what looked like tactical assessments. Not academic observations, but practical survival information. As the lecture continued, Professor Zethkar found himself watching Jake more than the holographic displays. The human's calm confidence was becoming more unsettling with each passing minute. When Jake asked about Earth again near the end of class, the professor was ready. Professor, you mentioned that no Deathworld has multiple extreme environments. Are you certain about Earth's classification? Professor Zethkar pulled up his data tablet. According to our records, Earth is definitely a garden world. However, He paused, scrolling through the information he had researched the night before. There do seem to be some inconsistencies in the data. What kind of inconsistencies? Jake asked, and there was something in his voice that made several students turn to look at him. References to creatures called polar bears that can survive in frozen wastelands and hunt prey through thick ice. Mentions of great white sharks that are apparently apex predators in your oceans. Something called a saltwater crocodile that can remain motionless for hours before attacking with enough force to crush bones. The alien students were staring at Jake now. And that's just the beginning. Professor Zethkar continued, reading from his tablet. There are references to pack hunters called wolves, to venomous creatures called snakes, to something called a grizzly bear that apparently stands 3 meters tall and can run faster than most vehicles. Jake nodded casually. Oh yes, we have lots of interesting wildlife. Mr. Miller, the professor said, his voice barely above a whisper. These creatures sound like they belong on a Class 2 Deathworld at minimum. Jake looked genuinely puzzled. Really, they're just normal animals where I come from. Professor Zethkar stared at his tablet, then at Jake, then back at his tablet. Class dismissed, he said suddenly. We will continue this next time. As the students filed out, Jake packed up his notebook and headed for the door. But he could feel every alien eye in the room following his movement, and he could hear whispered conversations starting behind him. Walking down the corridor, Jake smiled to himself. The Professor W. Professor Zethkar had not slept well. He had spent another night researching Earth, and what he was finding made less sense with each passing hour. The official records still classified it as a garden world, but the deeper he dug, the more disturbing. Details he uncovered, references to extinction events that happened regularly throughout the planet's history, mentions of ice ages and asteroid impacts and supervolcanic eruptions, lists of creatures that sounded like they belonged in Deathworld studies. Not garden world biology. Jake arrived for the fourth lecture right on time, settling into his usual seat with his notebook and pen. The other students filed in around him, but Professor Zethkar noticed they were sitting farther away from the human than usual. Word had apparently spread about his casual comments regarding Deathworld predators. Today, we will be doing something different, the professor announced. Instead of just learning about Deathworld creatures, you will be designing survival strategies for a hypothetical expedition. A murmur of nervousness rippled through the classroom. This was the practical application they had all been dreading. Your assignment is to develop a comprehensive survival plan for a research mission to a newly discovered Deathworld, Professor Zethkar explained. I will provide the parameters, and you must design equipment, protocols, and strategies that would keep a team alive long enough to complete their mission. The holographic display activated, showing a planet that looked like a patchwork of different nightmares. One side was covered in ice and snow, another in burning deserts, a third in dense jungles that seemed to writhe with movement. Your target world has extreme temperature variations, the professor began. Frozen polar regions with temperatures below -50 degrees, desert regions that reach over 60 degrees, and tropical zones with humidity levels that make breathing difficult. Several students were already taking frantic notes. The plant life is actively hostile, he continued. Carnivorous trees that can move their branches to grab prey, flowers that release toxic spores, and vines that inject paralytic poison. The water sources are contaminated with aggressive microorganisms that can kill most species within hours. The display changed to show various creatures moving through the hostile landscape. They were clearly predators, built for killing in multiple environments. The fauna includes pack hunters that can track prey across all 3 climate zones, solitary ambush predators that use the hostile environment to their advantage, and scavengers that follow the larger predators and attack anything weakened or injured. Professor Zethkar looked around the classroom. You have 2 hours to work in groups and develop your survival strategies. The best plan will receive extra credit, the worst. He let the sentence hang unfinished. The alien students immediately began forming groups, their various appendages moving frantically as they started designing elaborate survival systems. Crystal teamed up with Blade Dancer and 2 other students, their combined expertise focusing on protective technologies. Slime Trail of Wisdom joined a group that was already sketching plans for a mobile fortress equipped with energy shields and long-range weapons. Another group was designing atmospheric processors and environmental suits that looked more like small spacecraft than clothing. Jake opened his notebook to a fresh page and began drawing simple diagrams. He worked alone, occasionally glancing up at the holographic display, but spending most of his time writing. After an hour, Professor Zethkar began walking around the classroom to check on progress. The alien students had created impressive designs. Crystal's group was working on a survival suit that incorporated adaptive camouflage, temperature regulation, and built-in weapon systems. The key is to avoid all contact with native life forms, Crystal was explaining to her teammates. We stay inside the protective gear at all times and use remote drones for all sample collection. Slime Trail of Wisdom's group had designed what was essentially a small mobile city, complete with defensive weapons, air filtration systems, and emergency escape pods. We establish a secure perimeter and expand it gradually, Slime Trail was saying. Any native creature that approaches gets neutralized immediately. Professor Zefkar nodded approvingly at both approaches. They were exactly what he expected, from students who understood the dangers of Deathworlds. Then he reached Jake's desk and looked down at the human's notebook. Instead of elaborate diagrams and technical specifications, Jake had drawn simple sketches and written what looked like a basic camping checklist. "Mr. Miller," the professor said, "you seem to be taking a very different approach." Jake looked up from his notes. "Just trying to keep it simple, Professor. Could you explain your strategy?" Jake stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. The other students stopped working and turned to listen. "Well," Jake began, "the first thing I'd want to do is understand the local ecosystem. Every environment has rules, and if you learn them, you can work with them instead of against them." He gestured to the holographic planet. "This world has 3 different climate zones, which means the creatures living here have had to adapt to multiple environments. That's actually good news for us." Several students exchanged confused glances. "How is that good news?" "It means they're generalists rather than specialists," Jake explained. "They're tough and adaptable, but they probably don't have the extreme single-environment adaptations we've seen on other Deathworlds." Professor Zethkar found himself leaning forward. "Continue." "So, first, I'd want to find a water source," Jake said. "All the predators need water too, so if you watch a water source long enough, you'll learn their schedules, their territories, and their behavioral patterns." "But the water is contaminated," Blade Dancer pointed out, her mandibles clicking nervously. "Right. So you don't drink it directly," Jake replied. "But you can observe it. Watch what the local herbivores drink and when. See how the predators hunt around the waterholes. Learn the safe times and the dangerous times." Jake turned back to the holographic display. "Next, I'd want to understand the food web. What eats what and when. The carnivorous plants are a problem, but they're also an opportunity." "An opportunity?" Crystal asked, her voice sounding like breaking glass. "They're territorial," Jake explained. "Plants can't move, so they have to defend fixed positions. That means safe paths exist between their territories. You just have to find them." He pointed to his notebook. "I'd map the plant territories, identify the safe corridors, and use them to move around. The mobile predators probably use the same paths, so you learn their routes at the same time." Professor Zethkar was staring at Jake with growing amazement. The human was describing a survival strategy that involved living alongside the Deathworld's creatures rather than fighting them. "What about the pack hunters?" Slime Trail of Wisdom asked. "How do you avoid them?" "You don't avoid them," Jake said simply. "You make sure you're not worth hunting." The classroom went dead silent. "Pack hunters are efficient," Jake continued. "They don't waste energy on prey that's too dangerous or too much trouble to catch. If you understand their preferred prey and their hunting methods, you can make yourself an unappealing target." "How?" several students asked at once. Jake smiled. "Well, most pack hunters rely on scent tracking and predictable prey behavior. So, you mask your scent using local materials. Avoid areas where their prey usually travels, and never move in patterns that trigger their hunting instincts." He turned to face the class. "The key is to think like a resident, not a visitor. You're not trying to conquer the environment. You're trying to become part of it. And if that doesn't work?" Professor Zethkar asked quietly. Jake's expression became more serious. "Then you make sure you're more dangerous than they are." He returned to his notebook and showed the class his sketches. They were simple diagrams of traps, weapons made from local materials, and what looked like hunting strategies. Every predator has weaknesses, Jake explained. The pack hunters are dangerous in groups, but vulnerable alone. The ambush predators are deadly when they have the element of surprise, but much less dangerous in open ground. The scavengers are opportunistic, which means they can be manipulated with the right bait. Professor Zethkar realized that Jake was not just describing survival strategies. He was describing how to turn a Deathworld's own ecosystem against its apex predators. Mr. Miller, the professor said slowly, your approach is unconventional. It's practical, Jake replied. Heavy equipment breaks down. Energy shields fail. Weapons run out of ammunition. But if you understand the environment and work with it instead of against it, you can survive indefinitely. The alien students were staring at Jake with expressions of shock and growing fear. What he was describing was not just survival in a death world. It was mastery of it. Of course, Jake added casually, this is all theoretical. I'm sure the real thing would be much more challenging. But as he said it, he was smiling in a way that suggested he might actually find such a challenge enjoyable. Professor Zethkar dismissed the class early. He needed time to think about what he had just heard. Professor Zethkar had not left his office for 3 days. His desk was covered with data tablets, research files, and official reports that painted a picture so disturbing he could barely believe it. The more he learned about Earth, the more impossible it seemed that any life could exist there, let alone evolve intelligence. The final lecture was scheduled to begin in an hour, and he still was not sure how to handle what he had discovered. His hands shook slightly as he gathered his materials and headed for the lecture hall. Jake arrived early as usual, but today he was not alone. Word had spread throughout the academy about the strange human who talked about Deathworld creatures like they were ordinary animals. Other students who were not even enrolled in the class had come to watch. The lecture hall was packed. Beings from dozens of species filled every available seat, and more floated or clung to the walls and ceiling. Everyone wanted to see what would happen in the final class. Professor Zethkar entered the hall and looked out at the crowd. He had never seen so many students in one place, and their collective attention was focused entirely on him. More specifically, on what he was about to reveal about the quiet human sitting in the back row. Students, he began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. Today was to be our final lecture on Deathworld classification and threat assessment. However, I must begin with an important correction to our previous lessons. He activated the holographic display, and an image of Earth appeared. It looked peaceful from space, blue and green, and covered with white clouds. It has come to my attention that our databases contain a significant error, Professor Zethkar continued. Earth, the homeworld of our exchange student Mr. Miller, has been incorrectly classified. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jake looked up from his notebook with mild interest. Our records list Earth as a Class 1 garden world, suitable for most forms of life and presenting minimal environmental challenges. The professor paused, his compound eyes scanning the crowd. This classification is wrong. The holographic display changed, showing new images. A massive shark reaching the surface of an ocean, its jaws filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. A brown bear standing on its hind legs, towering over 9 feet tall. A pack of wolves moving through snow with perfect coordination. Earth's ocean. Predators include creatures that can grow over 20 feet in length and bite with forces that exceed most industrial equipment, Professor Zethkar explained. They can detect a single drop of blood in millions of gallons of water and track prey across vast distances. Several students made sounds of distress. The images were terrifying enough, but the professor's clinical description made them worse. The land predators are equally impressive, he continued. Pack hunters with complex social structures, advanced communication systems, and the ability to coordinate attacks across difficult terrain. Solitary hunters with strength-to-weight ratios that exceed our most optimistic engineering projections. More images appeared. Lions taking down prey twice their size. Eagles diving at speeds that should tear their wings off. Snakes that could kill with a single bite. But that is not all, Professor Zethkar said, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper. Earth's environment itself is actively hostile to life. The display showed hurricanes that could level cities, tornadoes that could pick up buildings and throw them through the air, earthquakes that could split the ground open for miles. Regular natural disasters destroy entire regions, the professor explained. Volcanic eruptions that can alter global climate patterns. Asteroid impacts that cause mass extinction events. Ice ages that freeze most of the planet for thousands of years. The alien students were shifting nervously in their seats. Some of the visiting students had already started to leave. The planet experiences extreme temperature variations from over 50 degrees above zero to 70 degrees below. Some regions have no rainfall for years at a time, while others are flooded by storms that dump months of water in a single day. Professor Zethkar changed the display again, showing microscopic images that made several students gasp in horror. Even Earth's smallest life forms are aggressively hostile, he said. Bacteria and viruses that can kill larger organisms within hours. Parasites that can control the behavior of their hosts. Microscopic predators that consume their prey from the inside out. The lecture hall was completely silent now except for the professor's voice. According to every measurement in our classification system, Earth should be rated as a Class 4 Deathworld, Professor Zethkar announced. By our scientific models, such a world should not be able to support complex life. By our theories of evolution, no intelligent species should ever emerge from such conditions. He turned to look directly at Jake, who was still sitting calmly in the back row, taking notes. But humans did not just survive on Earth, the professor continued. They became its dominant species. They learned to live in every environment there. Planet offered, from frozen wastelands to burning deserts to the deepest ocean trenches. Jake looked up and smiled slightly, but said nothing. They developed tools to hunt Earth's predators, Professor Zethkar said. They learned to predict and survive natural disasters. They built societies that could withstand asteroid impacts and ice ages. The professor's voice was getting stronger now, building to a conclusion that terrified him. They became so successful at survival that they began to feel sorry for other species and developed conservation programs to protect the very predators that had tried to kill their ancestors for millions of years. A shocked silence filled the hall. The implications of what the professor was saying began to sink in. And then, Professor Zethkar said, they built spacecraft and came out here to meet the rest of us. Every eye in the room turned to look at Jake Miller, who was calmly closing his notebook and putting away his pen. The creature we have been studying Deathworld beasts with, the professor announced, is himself a Deathworld beast. The most successful predator ever produced by the most hostile world in known space. Jake stood up and walked to the front of the class. The crowd of alien students parted to let him pass, and several actually moved away from him as he approached. Professor, Jake said politely, that was an excellent summary of Earth's environmental conditions. Very thorough research. Mr. Miller, Professor Zethkar said carefully, perhaps you would like to add anything to our discussion? Jake looked out at the crowd of alien students, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from fear to fascination. Well, he said thoughtfully, I think you may have made Earth sound a bit more dramatic than it really is. Most of the dangerous animals leave you alone if you leave them alone. The natural disasters are usually predictable if you know what to look for, and the diseases are manageable with proper medical care. He paused, considering. The real challenge on Earth is not the big predators or the dramatic disasters, Jake continued. It's the small things. The insects that carry diseases. The plants that look harmless but are actually poisonous. The weather changes that can kill you if you're not prepared. And how do humans deal with these challenges? Professor Zethkar asked. Jake shrugged. We learn. We adapt. We prepare for problems before they happen. We work together when we have to, and we improvise when our plans fail. He looked around the room at the alien students who were hanging on his every word. Really Earth-taught. Use that the universe is not trying to kill you personally, Jake said with a smile. It's just indifferent to whether you live or die. Once you accept that, everything else becomes manageable. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Crystal spoke up, her voice barely audible. What does this mean for us? She asked. For the rest of the galaxy? Jake considered the question seriously. It means you have new friends who are very good at solving problems, he said. Humans like challenges. We like figuring out how things work and how to make them work better. He gestured to the holographic displays that still showed Earth's various dangers. We've spent our entire evolutionary history learning how to survive on a world that was trying to kill us, Jake explained. Now we're here, and we'd like to help make sure the same kind of problems don't happen to anyone else. Professor Zethkar stared at Jake for a long moment. And if someone threatens your new friends? For the first time since the course began, Jake's smile became something that might actually be considered dangerous. Well, he said quietly, we're very good at protecting the things we care about. The professor nodded slowly. Class dismissed. As the alien students filed out of the hall, many of them were talking in hushed whispers. Some seemed frightened. Others seemed excited, but all of them were looking at Jake with new understanding. Jake packed up his notebook and pen, then stopped at Professor Zethkar's desk. Thank you for an excellent course, Professor, he said. I learned a lot about the galaxy's wildlife. Very educational. Professor Zethkar looked at the human who had been sitting in his classroom for weeks, asking innocent questions and taking polite notes. Mr. Miller, he said finally, what are you planning to study next semester? Jake grinned. I was thinking about taking advanced interspecies diplomacy. I hear it's important to understand how different species communicate and resolve conflicts. He headed for the door, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Professor,